Good evening, and welcome to Suffering in Silence with Minister Tia on Luv Bay Afrobeat Music Talk Radio. We are here with you every Friday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern. Luv Bay family, we're rising out of the ashes together. Tonight, our topic is the criminal justice system and domestic violence. We have with us our co-host, Carrie Hardy, and our guest on this evening is Dahlia Rancine, District Attorney of Douglas County, Georgia. Listeners, if you have any questions or comments for our guest or co-host, you can email us at sufferinginsilencedv@gmail.com. If you have any resources that you would like to share with us on a national or local level from your country, your community, or your local organizations, or your faith community, you can also email us at sufferinginsilencedv@gmail.com. And with that, Carrie, would you greet our listeners on this evening?
Hi, everyone. My name is Carrie Hardy, and I am one of Suffering in Silence's co-hosts. I helped edit Tia's autobiography on her experiences with domestic violence and her story of triumph over that. And that's pretty much what I do. I'm a creative writer. I specialize in stories of trauma and triumph. I also do brand storytelling and marketing on the corporate side. And I love telling women's stories. I love not only talking about and expressing the things we go through just as women on a daily basis, but also talking about how we're victorious over it and how we can use those experiences to empower ourselves. And I'm just so happy to be here and speak with Tia and Dahlia. I remember the first time I saw Dahlia, I graduated from Agnes Scott College, and she came to speak at, it was kind of a lecture, but it was a presentation, and she was talking about sex trafficking and everything, and she just really inspired me because of her dedication to women, and she's tough as nails, and I love her. But yeah, we're just so happy to have her on the show tonight.
Thank you. And Carrie, how can the listeners reach you for your...
My email is imagesattainable@gmail.com, spelled images and the word attainable. Everything is phonetic, no spaces. Imagesattainable@gmail.com.
Thank you. Dahlia, please introduce yourself to our listeners on this evening.
Well, ladies, thank you so very much for having me on here. I am excited to be here. Carrie, so glad that you remembered me from way back when, and we've had a chance to reconnect since then. That's really why you do the work, just spreading the word, getting the message out there, and you never know how it will touch somebody. I wish I was a creative writer. Girl, that's amazing. I love that. I'm just a prosecutor. That's all I do.
That is amazing, though. Oh my goodness. I don't know if I could prosecute. I one day hope to be an attorney, but I have no idea if I could prosecute.
Well, I don't think you ever know if you can actually do it until you just get in there and try and see is it your fit, is it not your fit, and you go from there. But I feel like it's funny because in my experience in prosecution, it's both been extremely quick and extremely long at the same time, and in how it feels in this weird kind of space of I can sit and feel like I just started yesterday, but it also can feel like it has been decades. But it's actually been about 17 years that I've been in the prosecution world. I've only been an elected for the last 19 months since January 2021. And then I had a 2-year stint with a nonprofit called Equitas, where we actually traveled the country and the world presenting on how to investigate and prosecute gender-based violence to prosecutors and law enforcement agencies, and allied professionals, because we often forget that this is a very collaborative approach when we talk about handling domestic violence and sexual assault cases. So that would include nurses, and it includes, forensic interviewers for kids who are witnessing. So yeah, just really have enjoyed pursuing my passion in my career in this area.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Dahlia, for being here. Listeners, as usual, we want to start with a few resources, and then we will go right into our topic. First, we have Douglas County Task Force. Their website is www.douglastaskforce.com, and their victim support hotline is 678 715-1196. In Carrollton, Georgia, there is the Carroll County Emergency Shelter. Their crisis line is 770-834-1141. And in Cedartown, Georgia, there is the Polk County Women's Shelter, Our House. Their crisis line is 770-749-9330. So again, our topic on tonight, criminal justice and domestic violence. And we really just want to talk about how victims and survivors are engaged in the criminal justice system. Dahlia, one of the very first things that came to my mind, if you could expound on it, is when we get into the area of victims and survivors, the recantation, how someone could go through the process of dealing with the police, the courts, after something horrific has happened to them, and for reasons that the general public may not understand, they actually recant their story. Can you help us to understand why that happens?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually extremely frequent and common in our domestic violence cases. And just to kind of expound a little bit on the recantation piece, basically, your victim, your survivor takes back saying the offender didn't actually abuse them or the incidents they described didn't actually happen. Mm-hmm. And it's very common, and there's a myriad of reasons. And I think that's going to be a common thread throughout this conversation, is that there's not just one answer as to the why for a lot of these things that we're going to talk about. The first thing is there's trauma bonding. That's huge. Oftentimes people don't understand that it's not as if when a partner is with their abuser that they're always being abused, mm-hmm. right? Like there are times when it's loving, there are times when it's comforting, there's times when the relationship is fulfilling. Mm-hmm. And so when the abuse happens, oftentimes it's what we refer to as the cycle of violence. Then the honeymoon period comes and it's the, I'm so sorry, it'll never happen again. And a lot of times we see survivors will cling on to that hope of change, cling on to the fact that maybe they won't do it again. Maybe this will be different. And so that's a big reason that we see. I think the other piece that often is misunderstood is that being involved in the criminal justice system is oftentimes another layer of trauma. Mm-hmm. Right? Like you've lived in this relationship, you've lived and existed in this space with your offender, but there was familiarity with it, mm-hmm. right? There was almost sometimes normalcy to it. And then here we come as part of the criminal justice system, and we kind of say, hey, we want you to tear off all of those scabs that you've tried to heal. We need to dig deep. We need you to tell us about all these things. We need to tell you about, emotionally, mentally, physically taxing. We know that you may be the only breadwinner. We know that you might have kids that need to go to school, but we need you to come in. We need you to disrupt your entire life so that you could be part of this process. And sometimes just the fact of being involved in that can be really difficult for victims and survivors of domestic violence. And so that could be a reason that recantation happens. Another piece is that, survival is survival. And if they mm-hmm. believe that it is more harmful to pursue a prosecution for themselves, then oftentimes we'll see that. What that could be is for financial reasons. Perhaps their offender is their main source of support. And if they go forward, they may be homeless. Their kids may not be able to eat. Like there are a lot of factors. It could be one, it could be all, it could be other things that, maybe I have not discussed now, but it's very complicated once a victim of domestic violence has the courage to disclose and what that looks like once they get intertwined within the criminal justice process.
Thank you so much. Another point that I thought of was the obstacles within the justice system. One of them is victim blaming, and I believe that victim blaming could be a reason for recanting a story as well. In my own personal story, I never had to go as far as going all the way through the court system to deal with my ex-husband. There were times that I called the police and I had to speak to police officers, but I never actually had to go to court and deal with him, face to face in that atmosphere in criminal court. But just telling my story to individuals, when I finally was able to open up and I started to try to get help for myself, and I started to try to do what I needed to do for myself, I had to deal with victim blaming. I was asked, what did I do? Well, why did I stay? If this is really happening, then, what part did I play in it? And so I could just imagine on a level of actually dealing with courts, what victim blaming would be like. Is that something that you see in the court systems, like actually in the courtroom, victim blaming, and how victims have to deal with that?
Yeah, it is an unfortunate reality for people that are uneducated and ignorant to the realities of domestic abuse. And those individuals, unfortunately, exist everywhere, including in the criminal justice system. We obviously know that there is sometimes law enforcement that are uneducated on the realities of domestic violence. There could be prosecutors. There could be defense attorneys, judges. So all along the way, there are individuals that do not understand the realities of those that are victimized within domestic abuse. And it is an unfortunate reality, and it's a lot of the work that we did when I was with the nonprofit was trying to kind of bridge that gap and help the different system partners to understand that. But let's not forget, it's an adversarial system, right? So you have a domestic violence victim who is able to disclose. And I want to just kind of give the caveat of language we're using here. In the criminal justice system, we have two different labels. It's a victim and a defendant. And by no means do I want to diminish the ability of victims to become survivors and how much strength and resilience that takes. And I'm not trying to again, diminish that, but it's just kind of ease of language of the system. And that's how we refer oftentimes as victims. But like, imagine this, you have the courage to finally say something. You make the police report, you endure the interviews, you go through trial prep, you get on the stand, you tell a box of 12 strangers, your jurors, everything that happened to you, and then you get put on cross. And a defense attorney goes and tries to belittle you, tries to embarrass you, tries to make you seem like you're not credible, tries to make you seem like you're vindictive. Like, this is the reality of the criminal justice system, and it exists at every level, which is why events like this are so important, because hopefully people are listening that are part of the criminal justice system or have the ear of those involved in the criminal justice system to say, we need to have better awareness. We need to understand this better so we're not causing more harm to the victims that come into our system.
Yes. So with that would lead just into my next point. Can you talk about the importance of prosecutors being trained to handle domestic violence cases? And I would think that there's preparation that needs to happen before you enter the courtroom, somewhere in the beginning of the process. When a victim first comes to you, there needs to be some awareness, some knowledge of what he or she is going through and dealing with. So can you talk about how prosecutors are trained or should be trained to handle domestic violence cases?
Yeah, great question. Let me start with the second one first. And I think the best way for prosecutors to learn is to gain perspective from the parties that are involved, meaning listen to survivors, listen to experts, listen to, your ER nurses that are encountering domestic violence victims within the ER. What are they hearing? What are they seeing? There's a lot of different individuals that we need to listen to have those perspectives to understand. There are a lot of resources. There's phenomenal conferences for prosecutors. There's a really huge one that happens in Dallas, the Crimes Against Women conference that takes place that's specialized just on prosecutors, investigators, victim witness advocates that just handle domestic violence, sexual assault cases. So there's a lot of resources, but that then becomes twofold because a lot of prosecutors' offices are grossly underfunded, meaning they can't even afford to get these trainings. Now, I will say one of the positives of the pandemic is that during that time period, we were offered a lot of free online training. And so there are opportunities now to get caught up for that. Now, going to the first part of your question about, how offices look and what are the duties, if you will, of the prosecutors assigned to cases. When I was a trial prosecutor, I was in two of the largest jurisdictions in Georgia, being Fulton County, which encompasses Atlanta, and DeKalb County, which has a sliver of Atlanta, and I believe it's the third largest jurisdiction in Georgia. And so we had the ability to have specialized units. And so it was areas we were concentrated on just handling these types of cases. And so as a new prosecutor coming into one of these units, you not only receive the training, but you receive the peer support. So when you had the questions, when you didn't understand why your victim was recanting, when you didn't understand why they, are willing to speak to you one day and not able to speak to you the next, like just all those dynamics, why they have flat affect, talking about super traumatic events without having any indication like they're upset, like talking about it like what they ate for breakfast. Just understanding all of that, that was a great learning tool and support for those that were in the field. Now, a lot of offices don't have that, and anybody can receive a domestic violence case. In our office, the way that we are structured, that's the way it is. Any of our trial line ADAs can receive a domestic violence sexual assault case. And so what we've been proactive about is offering those trainings, is being available, because there are several of us that do have a lot of experience in prosecuting those types of cases, making ourselves available. But there's always going to be a learning curve. Mm-hmm. And I think just like anything in life, experience is the best teacher. Mm-hmm. And they just have to understand, while minimizing the trauma and damage you cause to victims throughout that process.
Thank you so much for your answer. I have one more question, and then Carrie, I'll turn it over to you for any questions or comments. But as far as training, Dahlia, one, for prosecutors, is this training mandatory or is it optional? And then my second part of that question would be, I understand the training for prosecutors, but what about the defense? Is the defense team required to undergo any kind of training dealing with domestic violence cases?
All attorneys are required to have what are called continuing legal education in order to keep our bar license. Now, what those specific topics are required to be outside of things like, say, ethics or professionalism or a couple of other different categories, there are not requirements. So really, there's nothing that compels prosecutors or defense attorneys to have that type of training. Even less so, I would say, for defense attorneys. And I am not familiar with the trainings that are offered to them, but I know that there are associations like the Georgia Association of Defense Lawyers, the Criminal Defense Lawyers, GAFDL, who offers annual trainings to them. And I'm not familiar with what those curriculums are. But when you talk about what is the process in a domestic violence case, some obviously will be exposed to the experts on domestic violence, but it is not their responsibility or their duty to protect victims. It's their duty and their obligation is to protect the defendant. Now, I will say the reverse of that is, say, if you have a woman who is, or even a man who is in a domestic relationship and having the shift of going from primary aggressor to predominant aggressor, meaning we've had a shift in, okay, well, who threw the first punch, to why was the first punch thrown? Mm-hmm. Is this because it is like you're forecasting, you already know what the signs and symptoms of the oncoming abuse look like, and so it's almost a protectionist measure in having this action. And so there are trainings like that. But yeah, the really long answer to your question is there is nothing mandatory, but we definitely try to, in my office and the offices I've been in, try to really push at least a baseline understanding of the dynamics and the realities of these cases so that they can better understand how to deal with them.
Thank you so much. Carrie?
Thank you, Dahlia, for those explanations. That was very insightful. I didn't know a lot of those things. And in the beginning of you and Tia's conversation, you mentioned some aggression that the defense attorney can have towards the victim. And you also mentioned law enforcement portraying some type of maybe condescension or indifference towards victims or something like that. I wanted to ask about why that is, especially given the objective nature of police reports, because I remember when I was interning at a nonprofit service, and it was primarily for helping women who were violent of domestic abuse to get U visas. And I had to read a lot of police reports and look at a lot of pictures. And police reports are really written in like the most objective way possible. And there's normally pictures. So if you're reading this police report, like this woman is really being beat within an inch of her life, and she's screaming at her 3-year-old to call 911. And then how does that manifest into, oh, this person is being vindictive, or this person is playing the victim, when you literally have the police report right in front of you telling you what went on that night?
Yeah, so good question. And I think a lot of what you see, so a lot of our domestic violence calls are aggravated assaults, are strangulation cases. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of marks, right? There's not a lot of bruising. There's not a lot of injury. I think in the cases, Carrie, that you're describing, I think it's much easier for law enforcement when you see the physical manifestation of that abuse to be able to push that forward. But I think a lot of times, even when you do see egregious abuse, that there's a frustration when you have that recantation. And I mean, Tia really hit the nail on the head of like that. It's so frequent. And if you don't understand why, then you can become very disheartened with trying to help. It's like, well, if you don't want to help yourself, why should I help you? Mm-hmm. And so trying to change that mind shift to understand the why of the recantation is really, really huge. And I also want to say, like, there are so many amazing law enforcement partners that really do get this topic, that really will work very slowly at whatever pace in meeting our domestic violence victims where they are, connecting them with resources. And I would say that's our biggest key to success, is when we collaborate. Now, again, the defense attorneys don't have any duty, absent, again, if it's a case where they think that the person who's been accused of a crime was actually the victim. And so then they may advocate for, like, we actually think this is a victim of domestic abuse and not the perpetrator. But outside of that, what we often see is what they're doing their job. They're doing their job of trying to represent and zealously advocate for their client, which happens to be the offender in our domestic violence cases. And so everybody plays their role. It could be very frustrating. It could be, upsetting, because oftentimes the goal is to get the victim to have an outburst, or get the victim to, appear quote unquote crazy and be like, see, jurors, we told you, why should you believe her? And it's hard, but that's why it's our job to work with the victims. It's our job to explain to them what this process is. And quite honestly, it's our job as prosecutors to make sure that we don't put up cases that are only resting on the shoulders of the victim's testimony. Our job is to go find the corroborating evidence. Our job is to go talk to the witnesses, to talk to their friends, to talk to their families, see what they heard, to look at the cell phones, to understand what is actually happening in this situation, so that it is not just a he said, she said, or she said, he said, whatever pronouns may be involved, but we actually have evidence to support what they're saying, so that the victim is not left in that position.
Mm-hmm. And also, I wanted to ask about incarcerating people who are perpetrators of domestic violence and recidivism. So I've spoken to women who are victims of domestic violence and actively in it. And I'm talking to them about, protective orders and stuff like that. And they're like, I don't want him to get put in prison because, first of all, I don't want him in prison. And second of all, how is that going to change anything? If he goes into prison, he's just going to come back out and it's not going to change anything. So what would be your take on that? Like, why do women need to take active measures to pursue things like that, and to, when it's heinous enough, to get prosecution for themselves? Because there's a wide belief that it's not going to change anything, especially amongst women who are going through it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because oftentimes it can feel very disheartening in the process, or mm-hmm. even the system to protect them. But I will say that a lot of times what we see, there's a spectrum of what occurs, but what we do see oftentimes is an escalation of what starts as, what we would categorize as simple battery, escalating to aggravated assault, escalating to aggravated assault, strangulation. And so what you see is this elevation in lethality factors, meaning that as this conduct escalates, what you see is a higher risk factor to that victim of them actually being killed by their abuser. I can say that in the cases that we were having in Douglas County, our murder cases, up to just recently, it was almost evenly split with domestic violence murders versus other types of murders. And so this is not something that is a theory. This is something we see in practice. And oftentimes we can actually see the matriculation of crimes that happen to escalate all the way up to near death or death encounters. Strangulation is one of the biggest lethality factors. It takes nothing to kill somebody via strangulation. And if the offender is using that as a tool of coercion and control of a victim, they are very close to being able to kill them. Now, the other side of that is that there is a theory of courses called batterer intervention programs, which are often referred to as BIPs. The research that I have read on it, I have not researched it recently, but the research I've read on it in the past has had mixed reviews as to the effectiveness. We do know that recidivism is high in our domestic violence offender population, but there is, obviously individuals who are trying to break those cycles to figure out how is it that we actually stop this from just passing from one victim to the next, because oftentimes that's what we see, right? You have one victim who is able to leave that offender and they just find another one. And so knowing that we have to figure out a way, how do we change the behavior? What is it that got us here to having such a devaluing of your partner, to feeling like you have to have control and power over your partner? How do we interrupt that manifestation so that they are actually a safe member of our society?
Thank you so much. Luv Bay, we want to welcome you again to Suffering in Silence with Minister Tia on Luv Bay Afrobeat Music Talk Radio. We are here with you every Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, with a replay on Tuesdays at 1 p.m. and 7 p.m. Eastern. Also, a replay on Thursdays and Fridays at 1 p.m. And Luv Bay, we are continuing to rise out of the ashes together. We want to share some more resources. We have from the Virgin Islands, the Women's Coalition of St. Croix, Christian Virgin Islands. Their website is wcstx.org. We have the Puerto Rico Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Their website is PAZPARAMUJER.org. And in New Mexico, we have the New Mexico Coalition Against Domestic Violence in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Their website is www.nmcadv.org. We also have the New Mexico Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And their website is nmcsap.org. And Daya, my next question would be, if you could tell us about the training and technical assistance that you provide or that your office provides to law enforcement and police departments. There are several cases or individuals that I've seen or that I've spoken to, and the victims are very fearful of calling the police and dealing with the police because once the police arrive at the situation, whatever is going on, a lot of times the victim has been blamed as the aggressor, or the victim has actually been arrested. And so victims are fearful of calling because the situation can be misinterpreted. For instance, there are times that, police will arrive and the aggressor will be standing there nice and calm and cool and collected, and the victim will just be like up in arms, like just really upset and aggravated, and the police just don't understand this person is this way because of what just happened to him or what just happened to her, and the aggressor is playing a game. like, I'm cool, I have myself together, look at him, look at her, she's, lost it. So can you tell us about the training or technical assistance, that you provide that will help, police officers understand and be able to read these situations the right way?
Yeah, excellent question. So that circles back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier with the predominant versus the primary aggressor. And what that involves is doing a deeper dive into the context of the relationship. So oftentimes when law enforcement arrives on scene, they're getting a quick snapshot of that relationship, right? Tia, you explained it to a T of oftentimes what it looks like, where you have your offender who's cool, calm, collected, and your victim who is belligerent and irate and just very, very upset. And so what we have spent time on training, and I think have made great strides, is having that distinction of digging a little deeper, figuring out the context of what's going on, figuring out the why of what's going on. And in fact, the individual maybe being extremely cool, calm, collected, manipulative even of that situation is perhaps a sign of the reality that they are an offender in this situation. And so that's really important. But the other piece that I think often doesn't get discussed outside of law enforcement circles is that most of the law enforcement fatalities that are killed on duty happen responding to domestic violence scenes. It's very volatile. It could be extremely dangerous, especially if weapons are involved. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? If you have an offender who is willing to harm somebody who they assert to love and take them within inches of their life, why would they show restraint or control just because somebody shows up with a badge, right? Like they don't have that buffer or barrier to that. And so a lot of our officer involved or officers that are killed on duty are because of responding to domestic violence scenes. And I think a lot of that's also part of the training that we provide to them of like taking a step back, really assess and analyze the situation that you are arriving to, dig deeper, get the questions, separate, discuss, do the collateral interviews, talking to friends, the family, to neighbors. What do you all hear? Scheduling what's called forensic interviews if there are kids present. Kids are some of like the best witnesses to what has happened in this house because they've normalized it. So they just gonna tell it, right? Like, oh yeah, this happens every Tuesday. Like, this is just what we do. This is how we live. And, having the ability, I think, is very important when you do respond to domestic violence cases and you are having those situations that when you talk about resources, it's not limited to the two parties involved, because that's a big part of interrupting the cycle that we have got to get the kids to be able to stop normalizing these behaviors so that they don't then go and manifest. Because we know as children who witness domestic violence have a higher risk of either being victimized or becoming perpetrators. So that's the other thing that we also really focus on with law enforcement, of utilizing their child advocacy centers if there are kids there, because not only does it get really great evidence potentially from the forensic interview, which is done by different individuals, not done by law enforcement, it connects them to resources and therapy and family connections and things along those lines as well.
So by the time police officers or police departments, by the time they come into contact with you for whatever training and technical assistance that they received, is this the first of them receiving this type of training dealing with domestic violence, or is there something that is set up for police officers when they first become a police officer that is a part of their training to teach them at least something in the beginning?
Absolutely. So in Georgia, there's several different ways that individuals can become police officers, but in essence, they have to go through a rigorous course. Some larger jurisdictions will do that, like for their own officers within that county or within that jurisdiction, but most of them go to what's called GPSTIC, Georgia Professional Standards and Training Complex. I believe that's the accurate name for that acronym. But in essence, they have to go through several weeks of training to receive their ability to have post-certification, which gives them arrest powers. And in that training, they do receive some domestic violence training. So every officer that's going through that should theoretically be receiving at least foundational understanding, especially when we're talking about the predominant versus primary aggressor. And I would say when I was teaching full-time, when I was with Equitas, we often co-taught with law enforcement officials, because sometimes that's, who are you going to listen to more, right? Like if you're going to listen to somebody who's in the same work, in the same field that you are. And so oftentimes they were more validated in what they were saying, or made us seem like we were more authentic, if you will, in what we were saying, because they were vouching for what we were saying. Like, yeah, this is what I see on the street. Yeah, this is what I experienced. But I will say across the country, I don't know what those standards are. And I'm sure there's plenty of folks who maybe never have received it. But I will say that I know for a fact in Georgia that is part of that initial intake. But it's kind of like, when you're in college and you got all these classes, and by the time you graduate, you don't really remember what you talked about
right.
in that one in the first semester. So how much actually sticks, you don't know. But one thing that is extremely important for a law enforcement to understand is how dangerous responding to domestic violence calls actually is for them.
Right. And as you were talking, you answered my next question, because I was going to ask you, I know that you are in Georgia, and I was going to ask, is there a standard across at least the United States for all police officers or police departments? But it sounds like each state is up to, their own on the policies and procedures and training.
Absolutely. Now, I will say, for FBI and some of the federal agencies, I don't know what their training curriculum involves. And so I don't know if they're from that level, if there's something that's mandated as well. But I'm sure there's also professional standards that recommend having this type of training.
So with that, is there a great difference between if we're dealing with local law enforcement and then you go up another level to FBI? Is there a great difference?
Yeah, I mean, the vast majority of the cases are going to be handled at the local level. It has to involve a federal crime if it is going to be something that they're dealing with. So think of like kidnapping across state lines, or, for human trafficking cases where we know domestic violence is very prevalent. If, again, they're taking a victim across state lines, things along those lines where they may have it. But again, I would say like 99% of the cases are landed with local agencies. That's a total estimate on percentages, but I mean it to say a lot. Most of them are coming to the local agencies.
Okay. So I have one more question, and then Carrie, I'll go to you for a question and comment. But Dahlia, I wanted to ask you before we moved on, for our listeners, can you give some advice on how victims should address police officers if they need to be called to the scene? Can you give advice on what a victim should do or say or not do?
Yeah. Tia, that is a really great question, and probably like extremely complex, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times it really depends on the situation, because part of what we do obviously is we listen to how the case started to, and gathering all the evidence. And I could tell you that I've probably listened to hundreds of 911 calls. And it honestly depends on what is happening at that scene as to how intentional a victim can be in providing that information. And so I don't ever want to say it's the onus of the victim to stay cool and calm, because, there's a lot that's happening. But generally speaking, I would say the more detail you can give, the better. The descriptors, explaining what happened, explaining what the offender looks like, giving those details. So when they arrive on scene, understanding who is who, because obviously, 911 is just audio. They don't know who is there. They don't know who's involved. They don't know, I have teenage sons. And if, the police came to my house, of just giving the dynamics of who's in the home so that there's no mistake as to, who's present or anything along those lines. Because again, they're on 10 when they arrive to some of these calls, depending on how the situation is unfolding. So, if they're able to again, provide the detail, provide what's happening, get somewhere safe. I think that's the biggest thing. I can't tell you how many times that we've listened to 911 calls and they're on the phone with 911 and the phone actively gets snatched away or actively gets hung up, or you can actually hear, physical acts taking place on the phone. So get somewhere safe. That's the biggest key that I could say that needs to happen before calling law enforcement.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Carrie, do you have a question or a comment?
Yes. So we're talking a lot about gender discrimination through the lens of women, and rightfully so. But I wanted to ask, because there's a very prevalent idea that criminal courts and family courts favor women. So I wanted to ask you about that. Number-wise, does that hold true? Are there nuances? What do you think of that claim that family and criminal courts favor women?
Man, okay, I had to take a step back from what I actually want to say. But family courts, I can't address as much because I'm not involved in that as nearly as much. But I could say when I was in the courtroom, now as an elected, I don't really spend nearly as much time in the courtroom, but previously focusing on crimes against women and children, just the groundswell of commonality of just not believing women, and let me say this, I think that it's honestly, I think it is a safety mechanism. When you talk about, let's say in the jury trial setting, people do not want to believe these things happen, right? Whether it's child abuse, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, whatever it is, people do not want to believe it happens. And so when somebody tells how it happened, this is Dahlia Psychology 101. This is just kind of what I've surmised from the years and years of practicing. I think that if it becomes too relatable, they become very critical of what's being said, because then that exposes their own vulnerability to be victimized. If it's something that could happen to them, they are way more harsh on the victims that come forward. They don't want to believe how easy it is to be raped. They don't want to believe how easy it is to be brutally beaten. They don't want to believe how easy it is to be controlled and manipulated in all of these horrible things that occur. And so I don't think that it's, I honestly feel like it's a protectionist measure that has manifested in, well, she must have done something wrong. Because if that could happen to her like that, then it could happen to me. And so that's where we have that victim blaming to distinguish themselves from what they're hearing. But that's just one of my theories.
Yeah.
The other part is the societal piece, right? It's all the isms that are tied up in our society. And, we can't ignore that that's a reality. And I will say that I see it from jurors, regardless of how they identify based on sex, gender, ethnicity, race. Like, everybody has implicit bias. And that is definitely manifested when you see the criminal justice system and how they perceive victims of these crimes.
Mm-hmm. And I also wanted to ask about this idea of keeping the aggressor around, because fathers are a cornerstone or a pillar of the family. Because a lot of women, even if it's a stepfather, he's that male figure in the home. A lot of women are like, yes, I know that he slapped me or strangled me on Thursday. However, he's a good father. Or however, a man needs to be raised by a man. So can you talk to me about how likely it is for a child to be victimized if the man is abusing the woman in the relationship? Because I feel like sometimes there's a disconnect with that. If he's not putting my hands on my kid, I'm good. So can you talk to me about victims that are kind of facing this mental predicament?
Girl, that could be a whole show on its own. No, I think it's an amazing question. And so, yes, we see that a lot of, whether it's a biological father figure of being like, he's too important, I'm willing to sacrifice this victimization to have him around. But there is an amazing study that was done many, many years ago by Kaiser and at a university out in California on adverse childhood experiences. And we know that witnessing domestic violence ranks very high and that impact of having witnessed domestic violence, because oftentimes they're like, well, they didn't see it, but the kids hear it. They see the after effects. They know the before effects. Kids are so smart. They can pick up on all of those factors. But what we know is that when you have really high ACE scores, which oftentimes kids who witness domestic violence do, that it impacts their health, it impacts their education, it impacts their future relationships, and the statistics that show that it increases the likelihood of future perpetration of domestic violence or victimization by domestic violence. Because again, it's normalized. This is what a relationship looks like. And so the kids are unable to distinguish healthy relationships from unhealthy. And a lot of times we spend time talking to our domestic victims about that component. Like, if you can't do it for you, consider the impact it's going to have on your family. This is not healthy. This is not, the environment you need to be in, and here's the resources. And it's also, the audacity for us to tell them this, this is somebody they love, this is somebody they care about. And it may be the person who's paying their bills, and we're like, forget them. And they're like, but I need to eat, so there's a lot of layers to that conversation. I think the other piece to it too is that it's very common where the perpetration does not stop on the partner, right? A lot of times in our domestic violence cases, we know that there's child abuse also happening, physical abuse, excessive beatings. You came home and your shirt was dirty, so you get beat. All these different things that are happening within the household that maybe that are not seen as quote unquote abuse and just looked at as discipline, but really it's just an extension of the abuse that the partner is receiving and another level of control to say, stay in line. And so we're constantly talking about that, about family dynamics, about how this is not isolated to these two individuals, and it really permeates and damages and harms the entire family structure that's present.
Thank you so much, Dahlia. And you touched on this a little bit before, but can you give a little bit more insight on how domestic violence does cross paths with sex trafficking? It's not unusual, and it's more common than what I believe the general public understands. I mean, it's something that we try to speak of and bring attention to as much as possible, on this program. But domestic violence does cross paths with sex trafficking.
Yeah, 100%. So sex trafficking, Tia, another topic we could just cover a whole another session on that. But no, 100% to what you're saying. Sex trafficking is all about power and control, right? It is the utilization, the dehumanizing of an individual and turning a person into a profit. They will manipulate. They will use the terms like love and use really just brainwash an individual so that they can think that this is somewhere where they want to be, somewhere that is safe. So one of the strongest elements of power and control is domestic abuse. So obviously, in order to get this individual to subscribe to this devaluation of themselves, domestic violence is huge. It's huge as forms of punishment. It's huge as far as forms of all the other things that occur with these different types of situations, so that they are very, very connected, interrelated. I can't say there's been very many times where I've worked a sex trafficking case and did not see domestic abuse. But if there was not domestic abuse, there was a huge amount of emotional abuse, a huge amount of just the other ways that they are being controlled outside of the physical abuse. Because domestic violence, we know, is not just physical. It's right. Emotional. It's yes. All the different forms that it manifests. Verbal abuse. But abuse, domestic abuse, was very, very prevalent in every trafficking case I handled.
Wow.
And I think, and I remember, Dahlia, when you did that presentation and you played a recording of a pimp talking to one of his sex workers, and she was just telling him about her day. Well, he was like, "Where are you?" And then she was like telling him about her day, and then he paused and he was all like, "You're stupid." And then she was like, "What? How am I stupid?" And then he was like saying, and so like, I know exactly what you're saying. And it's really startling because you see that in, I guess, like husband and wife relationships next door. And it's like, I think that really highlights the like extremity and just horror of domestic abuse, because I feel like people don't realize how horrible and visceral domestic abuse is. Like a fear of death, which is often incorporated into domestic violence, or just complete dehumanization. That's a huge part of domestic violence. And I don't feel like people view it like that. They're just like, oh, that's something that happens. Yeah, it's bad. They don't realize the profundity of it.
100% agree. I feel like we use these terms and we like sanitize the reality, right? It's easy. We just make this overarching term. We just say domestic abuse, and we don't talk about what that's like when somebody's face is broken. We don't talk about when somebody, you know, literally becomes suicidal because of everything that they've been through. We say sex trafficking, and we don't talk about the fact, the reality of like how many men these victims are forced to sleep with, the STDs they carry, it's a way for us to easily refer to it, because obviously that's something that we need to communicate, but it also desensitizes the issue and it makes it something that's palatable, and we don't then have to dive deep. You know, it's just like domestic violence is bad and sex trafficking is bad, but we can ignore it if we don't talk about the realities of it, because we all agree it's bad, but you're not motivated to and activated to actually affect change until you dive in and understand what that looks like and how horrific it actually is.
And also how abusive making your partner feel stupid is. Like, people don't think about how abusive that is. They're like, or my husband makes me feel stupid. Like, that is horrible. And I feel like people don't see that as something that's really horrible.
Yeah, and I think that's where we need to continue to bring about the awareness. Abuse is mental, it's emotional, it's physical, it's financial, it's spiritual, it's all of those things. And there are times when I can say firsthand the mental and emotional abuse are worse than the physical. Their bruises eventually heal, but mentally and emotionally, you still carry that experience with you. You still have to deal with the trauma. You still have to deal with all the effects of it, the flashbacks, the fear, the emotions. It doesn't just go away. And so I think, unfortunately, that's what some people think, but I believe, it's, part of what we do to bring awareness to that. Abuse
Absolutely.
is more than you being able to see a broken bone and blood running down somebody's face.
Absolutely. And that healing that you're describing to is just so much more intimate. It's so much harder. It's so much, from the things that you can't see, the injuries, the harm that you can't see. And I just have to say, that all of those that have been victimized and have transitioned from victim to survivor to thriver, the true recognition and commendation goes to you all, because it's not easy to go through that process. It's not easy to speak up about what happened to you, to be judged about what happened to you, to make those decisions to choose you is huge. And it comes with a lot of consequences. It comes with a lot of work. It comes with a lot of rebuilding. And that can never be undervalued or underestimated at how tremendous that effort is, and just how amazing those that are able to see the other side truly are.
Yes. So as we are just under the hour, I want to ask you one final question, Dahlia, and then I want to give you time to share any resources that may be available, any resources that you can provide for victims and survivors. But I wanted to ask you, as the DA, do you see a difference in male versus female victims that come forward to actually prosecute a case? Because I know, as it stands where I am in my part of this, it's hard to encourage men to come forward, because not only are they dealing with the abuse, they're dealing with the fact that they, are a man, and society feels like, well, this should not happen to you. This can't happen to you. So do you see a difference with men versus women actually coming forward when it gets to that point, that level? Is it still an issue there as well?
huge difference. The numbers are definitely very heavy with female victims. Majority are in heterosexual relationships. For our male victims that we do see, the vast majority are in homosexual relationships. Very rarely do we see male victims in heterosexual relationships, but we do know, to kind of Tia, what you were saying before, that there is a lot of verbal, emotional abuse that occurs in those relationships, and just because you don't see the injuries doesn't mean that the abuse isn't taking place. And I think a big piece of that is the education component of what does abuse look like. Yes. Tia, you touched on that earlier. Like, people just think if it's not bruises and bones that have been injured, then you're not really hurt. And we know it's so much bigger than that. And so making sure that we have that awareness piece and that individuals are able to recognize it and to get the help they need.
Thank you. So as we close for tonight, are there resources that you could share that would be helpful to the listeners?
You shared my local Douglas County Task Force earlier on, who, of course, I will shout out. We also have Share House. There's also the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which can easily be found via like a Google search if you ever need anything. But I would say, always just say something. Find that confidant. Find that person who can assist you with it, because it is so scary to just say something. And find that person who will be your ally, who will be there by your side when you do that. And I will say that I'm so proud of our victim witness unit. They do a tremendous job because, like I said, it's not easy going through the criminal justice process, but know that there are people in the system who are going to help you. Carrie talked about some of her work that she's done as well, in helping with TPOs or helping with U visas, if that's the case. There's so many people out there in your community that are willing to step up and help you. So just reach out and find them.
Thank you so much. Carrie, you want to give us a final note for tonight?
I just want to say thank you so much, Dahlia, for taking the time to speak with us. We really appreciate it. We know how busy you are and how committed you are and everything like that. And to people listening, I just want to say, if you're enduring domestic violence, it's not something that you have to endure. Because I think a lot of, especially women, think that, oh, this is my life. When you're in a situation with domestic violence, that's not something that you're supposed to, I just have to take it. I just have to get through it. No. If you can, you need to tell someone. If you can, you need to distance yourself from the situation. And it's not even, because some people think that's selfish to take themselves out of a abusive situation, or how could you do this to the family? It's not that. It's about survival. It's literally about life or death. Because even if you don't physically die, there's a lot of spiritual death that's involved with domestic abuse.
Yes. And
it really takes everything in you to stay emotionally and mentally alive. So at the end of the day, it's your life. And you have to do what you need to do to survive, point blank. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies, so much for being with us. I want to share again the Douglas County Task Force. Their website is douglastaskforce.com. The victim support hotline is 678-715-1196. And the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Their website is thehotline.org, and their phone number is 800-799-7233. If you would like to, listeners, catch up on previous episodes from the program, you can visit our YouTube channel, Suffering in Silence DV. We thank you for joining Suffering in Silence with Minister Tia on Luv Bay Afrobeat Music Talk Radio. We are here with you every Friday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern. Luv Bay, we are continuing to rise out of the ashes together. Good evening.